Hi, my name is Gianfranco Selgas. I'm a PhD candidate in Latin American literature and culture from Stockholm University, Sweden. And my presentation is titled Canaima Reloaded, Slow Violence, Extractivism, and Sickness in the Venezuelan Amazon. In Rómulo Gallegos' Canaima, one of the epitomes of the Latin American genre novela de la selva, published in 1935, nature and wilderness are equal to the spirit of Canaima, depicted in the plot as, quote, an undetermined form capable of adopting any appearance, end quote, and from which the human, quote, will never free herself because those who penetrate it begin to be something more or something less than human, end quote. The novel, set in the Venezuelan Amazon, a vast territory richly endowed with gold, diamonds, and rubber, tells the story of Marcos Vargas, a young adventurer seeking wealth who ends up fighting against caudillos in the jungle of the Orinoco Basin. After defeating his enemies and consumed by the so-called jungle fever, Vargas leaves civilization in order to relocate near the Orinoco River, disappearing to never return from the depth of the Amazon rainforest. However, Vargas's desertion from civilization is not a matter of savage madness or the modern idealization of the jungle as Venezuela's last frontier, as traditional critical readings of the Romans of the Jungle have it. As Jorge Marcone puts it, Vargas's retreat to the Amazon rainforest, quote, is simply a modern subject's response to the process of modernization and to development policies, end quote. Marcone reads Vargas's story against the grain, questioning Gallegos' civilizer aspirations indebted to the epistemological separation of culture and nature, along with modern dichotomies rooted in Latin American history since colonial times. More importantly, the novel brings to the fore the steady transformation of the Venezuelan Amazon into what Macarena Gomez Barris has defined as the extractive zone, that is, the regions of extractive capitalism where the violence inherited by colonial modes of exploitation, quote, reduce, constrain, and convert life into commodities, end quote. The conflicting relationship between capitalism, modernization, and nature is, as Gallegos' novel hints, a long-durée issue in both Venezuela and Latin America that has been exacerbated in our present day. In contemporary Venezuela, for example, the Arco Minero del Orinoco, AMO, Orinoco Mining Art Project in Spanish, is a straightforward example of the ecological impact produced by capitalist development policies. The AMO covers and accounts for 12% of Venezuela's territory, and it was instituted by executive decree on February 24th, 2016, as a strategic mining zone to exploit the vast gold, diamond, coltan, and other mineral reserves in the Venezuelan Amazon. Historically, the region has alternated between neglect and attention on the part of the Venezuelan national and regional governments. After the Venezuelan crisis took over around 2010 due to the falling of both oil revenues and the political as well as judicial systems, the national government accelerated the exploitation of the AMO. Although governmental official statements refer to it as, quote, a model of sustainable mining, end quote, the environmental and ecological costs of this mining enterprise have been calamitous in terms of ecosystem degradation, health crises, the flourishing of illicit businesses, violations of human rights, and sovereignty issues in southern Venezuela. These issues have been extensively documented and discussed by scholars in the social sciences. However, approaches from the humanities to the artistic responses to the matter have been scarce, to say the least. The lack of in-depth analysis approaching the cultural production that systematically addresses the Venezuelan extractivism relationship is striking in a country in which oil and mineral extraction has determined the economy, political changes, large and small transformations in social life, and even various common cultural and mental archetypes. In this essay, I propose to reload Canaima as a starting point to discuss Venezuelan Jorge Tielén Armand's 2020 film La Fortaleza. The film tells the story of Roque, an alcoholic who tries to rebuild an abandoned tourist lodge in the Venezuelan Amazon, but ends up working in an illegal gold mine. By reloading Canaima, I propose to advance the critical potentiality immanent in cultural representations of extractive zones to reveal a different perceivable world and intangible spaces of emergence. As Jens Anderman has showed, Latin American cinema during the 20th and 21st century has deployed aesthetic and political tensions and correspondences to address the loss of the shared human and non-human world. By doing so, cinema, quote, opens our gaze to the emergence of a precarious life and the uncertain edge between the inhuman and the in-world, end quote. My analysis of La Fortaleza is aligned with such a reading and builds on a long tradition of Latin American eco-critical and environmental humanities scholarship. It focuses on coupling sickness with a symbiotic understanding of nature and culture, non-humans and humans. More specifically, I contend that the film functions as a cultural testimony of the environmental devastation of the Venezuelan Amazon. For most, the essay considers the entanglement of slow violence, mineral extraction, and sickness to cast a new aesthetic and political light over poison ecologies in peripheral areas of the global south. My conceptualization of sickness is both historical and theoretical. I ground my approach on Rob Nixon's notion of slow violence to account for the structural and historical violence embedded in environmental degradation and toxicity that is able to permeate the materiality of living organisms. The notion of slow violence, read alongside the representation of sickness and disease in La Fortaleza, shows that violence and toxicity are not only a sudden and radical alteration inflicted on individual bodies and places, but they also account for the different levels at which such infliction of harm takes place. In addition, my reading of sickness is theoretically indebted to Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari correlational notions of contagion and becoming. In order to understand sickness in the context of extractive mining in the Venezuelan Amazon, I approach these notions in terms of a human and non-human assemblage, leading to a conceptual reformulation to think outside the established anthropocentric framework. That is to say, if sickness is defined as the condition of becoming and being ill, it can be approached as a form of becoming something through contagion, for example, to become an ill body, a recovering body, a dead body, etc. In that sense, sickness and illness are read in this essay as assemblages between the human and the non-human. This historical, theoretical, and interpretative framework not only helps us better understand Thielen Armand's film, but also contributes to broader aesthetic inquiries concerning the visualization of our present-day ecological condition. By examining cultural media's relationship to the deep legacies and processes of capitalism and industrial extraction in the Venezuelan Amazon, this essay traces how cultural media situates itself in relation to the deep history of capitalism and its degradation of human and non-human bodies as well as environments. In what follows, I analyze the representation of alcoholism and extractivism as human and environmental sickness in La Fortaleza. The presentation concludes by pointing out how such a reading can help us better understand the film's embeddedness in conflicting approaches to the confluences between nature and culture in the present-day Venezuelan Amazon. To escape the socioeconomic crisis of Venezuela and his alcoholism, Roque retreats into the Amazon jungle to renovate a derelict cabin he built during happier times. Seeking by alcohol abstinence, in the film we see Roque coughing and vomiting constantly, as well as struggling with feverish visions. His desire for redemption becomes distorted when he joins his old friend Johnny, a corrupted member of the National Guard and leader of a settlement for illegal gold mining and drug trafficking in the region. Every encounter between Roque and Johnny involves the consumption of rum. Although Roque firmly rejects drinking, the frustration occasioned by the lack of money to repair the ruined cabin makes him drink again and accepts the job Johnny offers him in the open pit mine. Roque's alcoholic relapse goes hand in hand with the film's revelation through Johnny's illicit activities of the illegal mining practice in the vast jungle territory and its impact on humans and the environment. In several scenes of the film, Johnny refers to the contaminated water and how the gradual increase of mining in the zone has intensified the resurgence of diseases such as malaria and Zika. At the same time, Juan Luis, son of the indigenous mestiza Leudis who works for Johnny, suffers from an eye disease caused, as his mother explains, because of the water. Quote, since they are working in the mine, it could be the mercury that hurt his eyes, end quote. In La Fortaleza, the imprint of the AMO is not obvious, but latent through the brief scenes showing the extraction of gold, whether it be on barges, in other words, small floating operations where miners use suction hoses to bring up rock and sediment from the bottom of the river, or in the forest, as deforested terrain altered by hydraulic force and the employment of mercury, which acts like a magnet, drawing the flecks of gold from the sediment. Although these scenes are scarce, the film manages to channel the environmental destructions through the intoxicated bodies of Juan Luis and the eroded jungle, as well as through the figure of Johnny, who symbolizes the agent of degradation as he's the leader of the illegal mining operation. Similarly, the allusion to the polluted water highlights the presence of a slow violence and destruction that cannot be seen at first glance, and that La Fortaleza reveals by establishing a dialogue between what can be and cannot be said through words and images. In this sense, it is not only important to highlight the scenes in which Johnny verbally refuses to drink the water offered to him by Leudis, whom he forces to travel further into the jungle in search of clean water. Perhaps equally crucial for an eco-critical reading of the film are the scenes in which Johnny is suspicious of the polluted environment and what it communicates to him. For example, in some scenes of the film, the corrupt agent of the National Guard assures Roque that the rainforest's birds and chicharras, or grasshoppers, emit ill-fated messages. By taking Johnny's words seriously, the film invites the viewer to establish a point of contact between what the natural environment shows, for example, the images displaying the destruction of the environment, and what the non-human communicates, for example, both verbalized by Johnny in his conversation with Roque and by way of the sonic registers of birds chirping and insects buzzing. Images, voices, and noises make up this poison ecology of the Venezuelan Amazon in La Fortaleza, and so does silence. After Roque's shift work in the mine is over, he and Johnny spend the night drinking and talking. Contemplating an almost silent landscape, Johnny assures Roque that the absence of noise in the jungle is proof of the lifeless conditions of the soil they are mining. Quote, "See how quiet everything is?" asks Johnny. "That's because there is no life." End quote. Johnny's phrase is representative of the transformation of the Amazonian territory, a process of deterritorialization, to use Deleuze and Guattari's term, which implies the transformation of the jungle from a biodiverse natural environment to a lifeless and degraded extractive zone. In this way, the scenes of the film aesthetically communicate a political stand by showing, between the silence of words and images, the invisible presence of the disease that manifests itself in the devastated body of the jungle and the human beings. The film also offers tools to renegotiate the slow destruction of the environment and the disappearance of life. While Johnny tells Roque that there is no life in the Venezuelan Amazon, the film allows us to hear the distant buzzing of the chicharras and the chirping of birds. Although these sounds are almost imperceptible, they also serve as a testimony to show the resilience of living organisms that either resist or adapt to the transformation of the jungle into an extractive zone. Likewise, La Fortaleza aesthetically operationalized this through several scenes in which Roque comes into physical contact with the natural environment. Whenever Roque gets intoxicated with alcohol, or when he stops working his shift in the mine, the film breaks with the diegesis and it concentrates on the interaction between Roque, the wet earth, the plants, the river, and the Tepuyes, a tabletop mountain found in the Guayana highlands of Venezuela. The interaction between Roque and the environment breaks spatial and temporal relations in the film, subsuming the image to the encounter between Roque and the ecology that surrounds him. These will be the only moments in which Roque will experience another take of Amazonia. Put differently, these scenes highlight a contrast between the actual state of the territory affected by the extractive operations of the AMO and the natural spaces that are outside its reach for the moment. By coupling these two cinematic instances, that is, the images of environmental toxicity and degradation, and the images showing Roque and the environment interacting as an ecology of a species, La Fortaleza puts forward, as Gomez Barry puts it, quote, ways to see what lies within the ecologies all around us, and about how to perceive these things that are not usually available to the naked eye, end quote. Interpreted in those terms, the film does not advance, as one might expect, an idealized return to the natural environment, nor the harmonious relation between Roque and Amazonia. Rather, La Fortaleza works as a testimonial document gathering images that cannot be perceived in first glance, accounting for the past and present of the Venezuelan Amazon. The film manages to reload the story Canaima told 85 years ago by putting together another understanding of it. It is not only the representation of the jungle as a setback of the nation, nor the seclusion of the modern subject in the borders of the jungle to escape from barbaric civilization. Instead, it is a product of the historical crisis of Latin America's extractive zones, as well as the immaterial and invisible toxicities that come alongside such enterprises that have not been accounted for in its entirety. One last example is representative of the above mentioned. One of the most striking scenes in the film shows Roque sleeping the night after his work is done in the mine. The protagonist wakes up startled, coughing until he spits out a dead dog. Roque, hardly surprised by the event, stares at the dead animal in his hands. The scene is representative of an interspecies becoming between Roque and the animal. In the deterritorialized Amazon, converted into an extractive zone, both the human and the non-human must form alliances to protect themselves from the toxicity and disease that is decimated them. In that scene, And in that sense, as the jungle becomes a place of refuge for Roque when he wanted to avoid his alcoholic relapses, his body also becomes a place of refuge for the bat, possibly affected by the deforestation of the jungle to establish the gold mines. The search for refuge is important in the film. The movie begins with Roque leaving Caracas for the Amazon in an attempt to escape from his alcoholism, and as mentioned, the bat takes refuge in Roque's body when its habitat is destroyed. In the same way, the last scenes of the film show Roque seeking refuge in the depth of the Amazon jungle, overwhelmed by the violence of the extractive zone that eventually leads him to murder corrupted Johnny, just like Vargas does with the caudillos in Canaima. This resonates with Deleuze and Guattari's idea of symbiotic multiplicity, the assemblage between different human and non-human entities composed and related to in entangled matters. In this case, refuge in the body of the jungle or the human acts as another space for the entanglement and the interspecies assemblage. Finally, the film advances what Jussi Parikka has termed as the tight link between environmental issues and technology under, quote, the neocolonial arrangements that enforce situations of violence that only at times burst out in visible form, end quote. Back in Caracas, Roque brings with him flecks of gold to start anew. The mineral is used in exchange for money to buy himself a cell phone and a small apartment in the outskirts of the city. This subtle reference to gold as a commodity to sustain modern existence in the city is not minor, and reinstates the cyclic process of dependency and slow violence that maintains the functioning of the illegal mining camps in Amazonia. By entrapping the life of Roque in the circuits of extractive zone, the film brings to the fore the capital and geopolitical instrumentalization of the AMO as an alternative to fossil fuel extractivism in order to sustain human existence at the cost of environmental degradation. In that sense, even though Roque manages to heal himself from his alcoholic addiction and has a safe return to Caracas, the Venezuelan Amazon remains exploited and is reinforced in the film as the vast and infinite jungle plateau in which our technological modernity is shaped. Put differently, in La Fortaleza, the Venezuelan Amazon, as the polluted last frontier of capitalism, lies at the core of multi-temporal ecologies where past, present, and future, as well as human and non-humans, coalesce and coexist. In the last chapter of Gallegos' Canaima, Vargas' son, named Marcos after his progenitor, emerges from the jungle and is taken to the telegrapher Gabriel Ureña. Ureña, an old friend of Vargas, promises to take the child to Caracas to educate him. Gallegos' novel reiterates the 19th century civilizer paradigm by which the jungle is understood as the site of barbarism and the past, while the city is depicted as its civil counterpart and the promise of the future. In a different way, La Fortaleza rewrites such an idea, reloading the jungle as a site to rethink our present and possible futures to come. In other words, the film highlights human intoxication and environmental degradation due to mining extraction as two sides of the same coin, that is, the result of sustained and structural violence, slow violence, in Latin America's peripheral extractive zones. To conclude, La Fortaleza sheds new light over the intricate understanding of organic bodies in the Venezuelan Amazon by making visible the contagions and becomings of Roque, Juan Luis, Johnny, the bat, and the environment. These living organisms, either intoxicated by alcohol consumption, mercury, or simply by the effects of systematic harm to the ecological surroundings, for example, deforestation, land erosion, river poisoning, etc., are representative of the eco-mutations endured by the human and non-human in the extractive zone. Through Signex, La Fortaleza not only thematizes low violence, extractive capitalism, and human-to-human intersections, it also postulates filmmaking as an aesthetic and political testimonial that can be related to environmental justice movements against the crisis caused by illegal mining in the Venezuelan Amazon.